In many ways, The Power of the Daleks is one of the most important stories in all of Doctor Who. More than just any other points about landmarks, story quality, or the like, is the fact that it had to do one essential thing: make people accept that the protagonist and title character was now a completely different person. If they didn't want this new Doctor, that would have been it. It was a show that was struggling in the ratings from time to time, and frequently in danger of being axed. This was the moment that could make or break the series. William Hartnell had done a fantastic job with the show, playing against type as a wise, if curmudgeon, grandfatherly figure. But his failing health and sometimes contentious attitude had made them already start considering it during Season 3, to have Hartnell vanish during the Celestial Toymaker and reappear as someone else. Ultimately, they decided against that, which was really for the best, both for that story and in retrospect given how many actors would go on to play the Doctor. Now, the show had changed companions frequently. Hartnell would have more companions than other Doctors would over the course of his run. Now, this was in part due to the fact that he started with 3, while most of the others would usually have only 1 at a time. But it was also due to the fact that they were having trouble getting the right companions. After Vicky left, they had Katarina, whom they quickly realized wasn't going to be a proper fit for the show, followed by Sarah Kingdom, who didn't want to stay on past the end of the serial that she appeared in, followed by Dodo, who was so unremarkable a character that she left the show off-screen. This is all because they did not renew the contract for the actor who played Vicky, choosing instead to try to replace her, and failing for almost the entire rest of the season. Having learned nothing from that, they pulled the same thing with Steven, despite how well liked the character was and how much the actor enjoyed being on the show. His replacement, Ben, wasn't working out so well either, and was the current male companion of the Doctor, with Dodo's replacement being the much better received Polly, who was now the current female companion for the story, as of Power of the Daleks. So while the precedent was in place to replace companions, replacing the Doctor himself was uncharted territory, one that they had learned the hard way was full of landmines. They decided to offer the role to Patrick Troughton, who had actually declined a role in Season 3's The Gunfighters. Troughton had become well known for his skill as a character actor. That's why he was offered the part in Gunfighters. So he was skilled enough to bring whatever was needed to the show, and had the benefit of some name recognition, but not so much that they couldn't afford to hire him. Now, they could very well have simply replaced Hartnell with Troughton and left it unstated that there had been a change. This kind of thing was done. However, having a large child audience meant that it would likely confuse them as to how this stranger was being taken as the Doctor. So instead, the idea of a transformation that would be shown and acknowledged would be employed. After all, as a science fiction show, Doctor Who certainly had any number of reasonable ways that it could get around that. It wasn't as if this was a detective show or a western, where explaining that would be much more difficult. But in that case, then, who should this new Doctor be? Sidney Newman, creator of the show, was initially reluctant to cast Troughton in the role, but he was eventually talked into it. After 50 years of seeing the second Doctor, it might be hard to believe that, had the staff gotten their way, Troughton would have looked very different from what we wound up getting. Remember that he was a very versatile character actor, and pretty much whatever they were going to throw at him, he was going to be able to pull off. So what they had in mind was someone who looked more like a spacefaring pirate, if you could imagine that. He was all dashing and neat, and Newman took one look at him and decided it was all wrong. For Christ's sake, flop his hair, make him a cosmic hobo, rough him up, make him zany. Then he left, and they weren't exactly certain what to do, so they took that a bit too literally. When Troughton came out again, he was absolutely cartoonish. Battered top hat, oversized shoes that were open at the ends. He looked like he stepped right out of a comic strip of a hobo. Newman took one look at him and was absolutely aghast at how everyone could make such a colossal mistake and tore them a new one, saying that they had turned the show into a complete farce. After he stormed off, Troughton assured everyone that he knew what Newman had in mind. Whether he did or not is open to interpretation. We do know that Troughton was getting very frustrated. He agreed to do this against his own better judgment, fearful that he would be typecast in this new role. And now they didn't even know what that role was. So he took a far more active part in shaping what the character was, while using Newman's cosmic hobo as a starting point. It might seem surprising, but it was more along the lines of McCoy's chess master. It wasn't going to be the same, often bombastic doctor that we had known. He would be a brilliant man and subtle. He would be more inclined to manipulate people and set them off guard by his clownish behavior, hence the addition of the recorder, something to amuse his own children, but also to help show him as an eccentric that people would write off as being unthreatening, while all the while he's quietly watching, noting, and plotting. The buffoonish exterior would amuse the kids, and yet would also serve as a mask that the doctor would wear to hide the subtle genius that lay underneath. It was a risk, and Troughton was worried about the effect that this could have on his career. That's why the normally good-humored man became extremely upset when Crace and Wills, his two co-stars, showed up wearing t-shirts saying, "Bring back Bill Hartnel," as a practical joke. He had so much riding on what he was believing more and more was a terrible decision that it took quite a bit of time to console him and assure him that they were happy to have him on the show. It's been said that many felt that his mere presence was making them be better actors simply by trying to keep up with him. For his first adversary, this new doctor would be facing off against his most famous adversaries, the Daleks. This was an interesting problem in that the Daleks would be the victims of their own popularity. More on that in a little bit. Terry Nation, their creator, had been looking for ways to really cash in on them. As Terrence Dicks says, Nation is pretty much the only one who ever made a profit off Doctor Who. With the two Doctor Who movies which featured them, Nation had hoped that they would have had enough worldwide recognition for him to be able to create a series around them. So focused was he on this idea that Doctor Who was getting less and less of his attention. The Daleks' master plan would require a great deal of rewriting, or just plain writing, be done in order to get it out, and so rather than being written by Nation himself, this story was to be written by David Whittaker, who had been script editor when the show began. And it would receive a bit of refinement by Dennis Spooner, who had filled in on those Dalek Master Plan episodes. Whittaker would also pen the season finale story of Evil of the Daleks. It was a smart script, and the only reason for rewrite was to turn the bland doctor, which was necessary since his character had not been determined yet, into Troughton's doctor. Nation himself is reported to have disliked both stories, but they would go on to be considered amongst the greats, not only of the Daleks, but of the series itself. And it was a wise move. The Daleks were so popular that letting audiences know that this new doctor was going to go against his classic adversary was sure to cause a ratings boost, with the hope that they would stick around then for further adventures of Troughton's doctor. Reception was mixed. Children loved the new doctor with his silly antics, but many grown-ups felt that the character was a step backwards. However, the sophistication of the story began to grip this adult audience and would lead to Power being one of the most beloved Dalek tales ever. An impressive achievement considering what its fate would be. Due to a wide variety of issues, keeping videotapes, which is what Doctor Who was recorded on at the time, was seen as a waste of money. They were huge, not the VHS tapes you might be familiar with, but massive things, difficult to edit and very expensive. As a result, the tapes would frequently be wiped and reused, and this was no exception. This is the reason why so much of British cultural history on television has been lost. But at least in Doctor Who's case, virtually every episode was transferred to 16mm film. These episodes would then be licensed to overseas studios for broadcast. This is where the popularity of the Daleks hurt the story. Terry Nation's agreement with the BBC led to Dalek episodes being pulled from this overseas distribution. This is why even though 26 Dalek episodes were created in seasons 3 and 4, only 4 survive today. A mere 2 copies of Power of the Daleks were ever created, and because the BBC did not have an archiving system in place yet, did not think they would ever need an archiving system, either the studios overseas would have to destroy the episodes or send them back to the BBC to destroy it themselves. Fortunately, a number of episodes of the Doctor Who series survived this process, in some cases thanks to studios failing to follow through on that. The recent recovery of The Enemy of the World and most of the Web of Fear shows that. But given that there were only 2 copies ever made, it's sadly no surprise that not one episode of this 6-part story survived. A few clips taken to be used in other series do still exist, a couple short recordings by a fan pointing an old-fashioned film camera at the TV, but that's it. Oh, it wasn't without reason. It wasn't because of malice, and not entirely by short-sightedness. At the time, it really did make sense. But it doesn't change the fact that this landmark story was deliberately destroyed forever. But there was some small comfort to be found here. Some fans of the show had taken to recording the audio onto cassette tapes. Home video recorders were for the most part non-existent, but fans would hold up a microphone to the set, or in one case, wire up a recorder directly into the speaker system to create a recording without ambient room noise. So at the very least, we have the audio of every single episode of Doctor Who that's missing, including the 6 that make up this one. The BBC would make use of these recordings, and Power of the Daleks was among a small number selected in 1993 for release to fans. To explain what was going on, Tom Baker, in character as the 4th Doctor, would provide linking narration written by Eric Sayward. However, the audio track wasn't perfect. Some of it was even impossible to understand, so in 2003 the BBC commissioned a cleaned up version of the audio and re-released it, this time with narration provided by Wills, because the Tom Baker recordings, ironically, had been wiped. Nobody ever learns anything, I guess. An MP3 CD was also created that combined the new audio editing with telesnaps, photographs taken of the actual episode's broadcast form, for a simple reconstruction. This was the only story that would receive such a release, and in fact was the second of only a handful of official BBC reconstructions ever done. The first was of the last episode of The 10th Planet that was on VHS. However, over the past several years, stories that were mostly complete, such as The Invasion, The Ice Warriors, and The 10th Planet, were having the missing episodes replaced with animation. This was only in those cases when the extra expense was deemed justified. For example, The Underwater Menace, which has 2 surviving episodes and 2 missing episodes, is a story that falls basically into 2 camps. So bad it's good, and so bad it's awful. And so in that case, the expense simply wasn't worth it. But given that, it seemed unlikely that even missing 4-part episodes such as The Mythmakers or The Macra Terror would be impossible. Never mind the number of 6-part stories from throughout Troughton's run, including Power of the Daleks. It was thus shocking when the BBC announced that in time for Troughton's 50th anniversary that they had commissioned for all 6 episodes of his first story to be fully animated. After painstaking work beginning in February 2016, this project was finally completed on October 31st, just days before the announced release on the BBC store, along with television broadcasts both in the UK and abroad, and a special theatrical showing. And of course, a DVD release. Not available worldwide yet, but I did manage to get a copy shipped to me by Amazon, so let's take a look at this restored classic, The Power of the Daleks.